When Susanna was rushed into emergency labor, she hoped with everything that her baby was going to be okay. She had prayed for this baby for years, but when the doctors presented the child to her, she immediately knew there was something wrong. For years, sweet Susanna and her husband had been trying to fall pregnant with the baby. Finally, she was pregnant again, and this time the baby was thriving in her belly. Unfortunately, due to all the miscarriages she had in the past, Susanna was very wary of modern medicine. In her eyes, it was the worst thing for her unborn child. She insisted that she didn't need any ultrasound activity, vaccinations, or checkups. She was convinced that through holistic nature care, she could trust her body to grow her little one in a healthy manner. Her husband was supportive of it. He didn't mind that she was pursuing this course, as everything seemed to be going smoothly. The little one was growing in her belly, and Susanna seemed to be doing just fine, besides a little swelling and fatigue here and there, but Susanna reassured him the whole time that it was completely normal. That if the need arose, he could rush her off to the hospital as quickly as he could, but until that time came, he had to leave her be. Susanna tried to carry on as normal as possible. She continued her exercise routine and attended work as normal. As her tummy swelled, she began reading to the baby and enjoying the movements that it made. It was a glorious experience. One she had waited so very long for. When she entered her third trimester, things started changing a little. What seemed like overnight, she swelled up with fluid retention. So much so that her feet began to throb, almost like her skin was a bit tight. The baby also began to slow down a little, not being as active as in the past. Susanna did some research, but was consoled by the idea of the baby simply getting bigger, which prevented more movement. Her swelling, however, was not as straightforward an issue. When she did her research, the condition seemed to be a little concerning, but not enough for her to go to a hospital. If it were up to her, she would stay away from such a germ-filled place as long as possible. Of course, she never told her husband what she was suffering with. She didn't want to concern him unnecessarily, so she hid her feet and tried to carry on as normal. However, this failed. It didn't take very long for him to realize that his wife was not well. Her face was double the size it had been when he went to work that morning. Her skin was clammy, and soon enough she wasn't even speaking sense. Frightened at what was happening, he threw her into the car and rushed off to the hospital as quickly as he could. When the ER staff wheeled Susanna in, they immediately asked who her OBGYN was. Hearing that she didn't have one, the staff almost automatically knew that she hadn't done all the routine checks. Because of this, they expedited getting an OBGYN to see what was going on. Based on her vitals, they could see that her blood pressure was sky high. This was never a good sign for a pregnant woman. It almost always meant that tragedy was looming. They needed to check the health of the child and get it out as quickly as they could. Upon her very first ultrasound at 34 weeks, the doctors couldn't see much out of order, but that was going to change soon. Susanna's condition continued to worsen. Her basal body temperature began to rise all too quickly, and she began to sweat like she was running a marathon. Her heart rate and blood pressure continued to rise too. The doctors were concerned. They needed to operate as soon as they could, but they weren't sure how she was going to take it. They had dealt with her type before and knew that those staying away from conventional medical practices generally didn't take to emergency procedures very well. But she was reaching a point of delirium, one that she needed to calm down from and fast if she was ever going to meet her child. The surgeons pulled her husband aside and immediately began explaining what was needed. He wasted no time informing Susanna. Just like they had suspected, they were met with great protest, but this was subsided by her husband's pleas for her to think of the bigger picture. If she was stubborn, both she and her baby could die. So very reluctantly she consented to an emergency C-section. Once she had signed the paperwork, it was like a domino effect. Everything began falling into place. They quickly prepared her for surgery and placed a mask on her face, but a few seconds later, she couldn't see anything at all. Everything was black, and soon she was unconscious. Relieved that they were able to get their patient into the OR as drama-free as they had, the medical staff now set their sights on getting the baby out safely. However, this was proving to be a far more difficult task than usual. Just as they had suspected, Susanna had developed preeclampsia and had obviously had it for a while. Her elevated blood pressure made it extremely hard to operate. They needed to be absolutely sure that they didn't cause too much blood loss, otherwise she would die. But they needed to get the baby out, so they expertly navigated the complicated C-section. The surgeon Dr. Madib worked diligently to be precise in his incisions. He wanted as minimal damage as possible. His main concern was the mother, as it was his job to make sure that she got home safely with her baby. Within 5 agonizing minutes, they had Susanna open and were able to get the baby out. Without much thought, the surgeon routinely delivered the baby and cut the umbilical cord. Without much of a glance at the baby, he handed her off to the nurses on his side, eagerly waiting to fulfill their jobs. While he sewed up the mother, he would listen out for the baby's cry from the APGAR test. Very often, due to the cold nature of the theater, paired with the very bright lights, the babies stimulated themselves, but this baby was different. Dr. Madib waited, listening attentively for the first healthy cry, but there was nothing. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the pediatrician and nurses working frantically on the baby. Then, all of a sudden, he heard a collective gasp coming from the corner of the room. Ignoring it, he knew that whatever was happening in the corner needed to stay there. He needed to focus on getting Susanna well again. This started, of course, with sewing her up and then getting her blood pressure down. It was very much touch and go. Every time they thought they had stabilized her blood pressure, she was faced once more with a spike. Her body was going into absolute shock, one that she was struggling to control, but after a blood transfusion and a drip, they finally managed to get her stable once more. Thankfully, she was under general anesthetic, so she wouldn't be traumatized by the incident. That was one consolation to the surgery team. They rolled Susanna into recovery and left her to wake up in her own time. Once that was done, the intrigued surgery team checked in with the baby's team. They wanted to know what all the commotion was about earlier. What they discovered was simply startling. And they too gasped in shock. Their hearts broke for the mother who had just gone through trauma to bring this little one into the world. How were they going to break the news to her husband? Naturally, he was the go-to person to speak with. They immediately updated him on Susanna's condition and took him to see his daughter. They warned him about what he was about to see, and let his intuition take control the rest of the way. When Susanna opened her eyes and began to regain consciousness, it took her a good while to remember where she was. Dazed and confused, she looked around the room in panic. Naturally, her hands flew straight to where her once round belly had been. A smaller bump was still there, but it felt unnaturally empty. Then a wall of pain hit her, and she realized that she had moved too suddenly after having the surgery, but she didn't care about her pain. She had been promised that her baby would be there when she woke up, and yet she was all alone in her room. Her eyes welled up with tears. She was convinced that she had lost her baby. Barely being able to move, she frantically called for help. When her husband entered the room, with a calm look on his face, he began to calm down. He immediately began to console her, telling her that the pain was going to be over soon. But once again, that was not what she cared about. Through her sobs, she asked after the baby. At the mention of their child, she saw a flicker of something cross her husband's face, but he very quickly recovered. Still, it was enough to send Susanna spiraling again. Panicked, she began to sob, expressing that she thought her baby had died and that no one was going to let her see it, but at this, her husband shook his head and smiled. He told her all about how beautiful their little girl was. He then pointed at the empty bassinet next to her bed and explained that the baby was just out for some tests and would be back soon. This immediately calmed Susanna, but only for a few seconds. Tests. What kind of tests were they running? Was the baby okay? She couldn't help but feel that her husband was keeping something from her. That is until the doctor brought the baby into the room. They handed her the sweet little pink bundle and introduced her to her daughter. Susanna's eyes once again welled up in tears. Her little girl was in her arms. It was everything she had ever prayed for. She squeezed her eyes shut and thanked the universe for everything she had. Once she had opened her eyes again and wiped away the tears, she finally took a good look at the baby. It was then that she noticed everyone else in the room scanning her for a reaction. Confused, she looked back at the baby. It was then that she noticed something quite stark, but hard to see at first. With her little angelic eyes closed, her eyelashes fluttered with movement, but it was noticeable enough that her eyelids concaved into her skull. Puzzled, she looked up at the staff and her husband surrounding her. It was then that she realized that they had been waiting for her to see this. Where the baby's eyeballs were meant to be, there was nothing. The baby had been born without eyes. Trying to find the words to ask, her husband quietly shushed her and began to explain. Their daughter had been born with an eye issue that gave the appearance that she had no eyes at all. The eyeballs were there, but they were flattened. And this was why the eyelids seemed so strange. Of course, this was quite scary to hear, and Susanna's mind automatically began racing ahead to all the other possible things that could be wrong. But her doctor interjected and explained that the worst complication of their daughter's condition was that she was blind. Other than that, she had a perfectly healthy baby, one she could be happy and proud of growing. This, Susanna felt very conflicted. Her daughter would never be able to see the beautiful world she had been born into. Was this her fault? Could she have done something to prevent it? The doctors explained that it was a random phenomenon, one she couldn't have prevented. However, if she had gone for scans, they might have been able to pick it up much earlier. Susanna felt that she had failed her daughter. If only she had gone the more conventional route, maybe then they could have done something to help her. Feeling utterly inadequate as a mother, she asked everyone to leave the room. She told her husband to take the baby with him. She needed to be alone. Once she could walk again, Susanna waddled to the hospital's chapel, where she prayed for guidance and forgiveness. She spent hours in the chapel, trying to figure out what to do. It was only when she came across a blind young woman in the chapel that her view began to change. At that moment, something unbelievable happened. While deep in prayer, this young beautiful woman made her way to Susanna and simply put her hand on her shoulder. Without much context at all, she said, "Everything is going to be all right." Out. Susanna was speechless. Before she could say anything in return, the woman simply walked away, using her stick to guide her. Susanna sat in awe. She had received her sign. She needed to bolster her courage and face her family. She had a baby she needed to mother, and she was not going to fail her again. Returning to her room, she called her husband to join her with their daughter. She looked past the child's deformity and tried to focus on everything else. Yes, she may never look into her beautiful eyes, but she would be able to hear her mother's voice when she told her stories. She would be able to feel her daughter's touch when she rocked her to sleep. There was still so much to experience and enjoy. She wasn't going to let a small difference take away one of the best things that had ever happened to her. Bravely, Susanna turned to her husband and apologized for her outburst. She needed all the help she could get and the professional opinion on how to move on. She was done doubting medicine. She was ready to trust the doctors with her daughter's well-being. At this, her husband smiled ear to ear and began explaining the therapy he had been learning at the hospital. He had already begun working with an occupational therapist and psychologist, learning how to navigate it all. Hearing that the love of his life and mother of his child was willing to join him simply made his day. But this wasn't all. Susanna also wanted to share her story with the rest of the world. She wanted to let other expectant mothers know that while the medical community and the hospital procedures might look scary, they're paramount in ensuring the safety of their unborn babies. She had chosen not to trust her doctors, and in turn she had been thrust into a shocking situation with no tools to support herself, but she wasn't going to make this mistake again. When her story spread online, many people praised her for her reaction to her daughter's disability and her ability to admit her mistake about the medical community. Some people even gave her advice on how to properly raise a blind child. And so the family embarked on their own little adventure of life, different from how others may approach it, but beautiful all the same. Their daughter's rare deformity wasn't going to stand in the way of anything. Regardless of how many people gasped when they saw her, she was perfect in every way to them. What a beautiful story about unconditional love. How would you have reacted to such a situation? Do you think a prenatal scan would have changed anything? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and until next time.